Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Bow, 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 bow.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you loyal listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, October 11, 2025. We begin with our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, as well as Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne, being joined on the line first by Caleb Gayle, professor of journalism at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, and author of the book Black Moses, a Saga of Ambition and the Fight for a Black State. After that, Dr. Horne will be in conversation with David Tyroler Romine, lecturer of history at Winston-Salem State University in North Carolina and author of the book Something to Do with Power, Julian Mayfield's Journey Towards a Black Radical Thought, 1948 to 1984. Be sure to stay tuned and stay enlightened as usual. Now, while we are in Fund Drive and still able to bring you this much quality content, we want to remind you to please support our efforts here at KPFK. Community radio is much more than radio. This station is a look at your community. We come together to be informed, entertained, and enlightened, and what you get on this station is greater than what you'll find on social media or streaming services. That's because this station is committed to community first. I'm here to remind you that you rely on this station for news, music, and culture. You value community radio for enhancing your town as a place that you love. Now is a good time to support this nonprofit station with a financial contribution. Donations from people like you make this station possible, and here's how you can help. To make your pledge today, call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, or go online to kpfk.org and make your pledge right now. So now that you have decided to make your pledge, I want to remind you that I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Common with the Soulquarians, Saifo Gumede John Coltrane, Hank Mobley, and George Benson. Now, people, get ready for this train a-comin', taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for this interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Caleb Gayle.
Listen to my love science, your power and pride, so beautiful. May God bless your soul.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Caleb Gayle, professor of journalism at Northeastern University in Boston, and author of the book Black Moses, a saga of ambition and the fight for a Black state. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Gayle.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So why did you write this book, Black Moses, and why do you term Edward Preston McCabe a Black Moses?
Sure. Black Moses is often a name either ascribed to Isaac Hayes' phenomenal album or to Marcus Garvey. But McCabe's work significantly predated Marcus Garvey. And growing up in Oklahoma, especially coming to Oklahoma from New York, of all places, we didn't necessarily expect to be immersed in a part of Black history that's for so long been overlooked. But upon getting to Oklahoma and learning about a lot of the towns that surrounded where I grew up, it became clear to me that a lot of these all Black towns had a story that was richer, a story that was much more complex. And it seemed as if many of those roads, not all roads, but many of those roads led back to this guy named Edward McCabe. And when I was in college and was attending the University of Oklahoma, went to Langston for an event. Langston's the HBCU in Oklahoma and the furthest west HBCU in America. There's a plaque in the town adjacent to it called Guthrie, in which I saw this guy's name emblazoned on it, named Edward McCabe, and thought for sure that his efforts were something of a fiction. But as I came to learn, it was nothing if not true. And that to some extent also answers your other question, which was really about why did I call him Black Moses, or why would I ever even name the book that? Both in ways that were antagonistic and in ways that were supportive. McCabe's title as a Moses, or the one who would be Moses, or Black Moses, was often used by his detractors as a way of mocking him, right? Moses historically didn't make it to the promised land. He got to see it, but he didn't get to experience it. And then for his supporters, it was a clarion call to attract people to Oklahoma. And so the reason I wrote it was in part because I wanted to tell an iconic and quintessential American story, right? People trying to begin again under the leadership of perhaps the most unexpected man, a never enslaved Black man who grew up in the Northeast. But that just felt to me so deeply American in all the ways that are laudatory and all the ways that are problematic and challenging. And so it seemed as if McCabe was the perfect Virgil, the perfect cipher through which to tell this really grand tale that feels as American as anyone else's, except the people he led were Black. And in many cases, those people and their ambitions, especially his, were capped from the start, even though he decided to try anyway.
So did McCabe and the movement he led actually present a serious threat to white supremacy?
So the short answer is yes. But then the longer answer is many efforts to try and achieve any level of parity within the context of zero-sum politics, right? The idea that if I win, you lose, and if you win, I lose, and on and on and on, makes it such that any attempt, valiant or not, any attempt or effort, large or small, can be seen as a legitimate threat to white supremacy, right? Like, what if McCabe's vision had worked, right? What if those black towns, like they have survived, right? When he went to go meet with Benjamin Harrison in the White House, his plea was pretty simple, right? Which was, let us show you that we can govern ourselves. And so the very vision of black people governing themselves without encumbrance, without hindrance from a more dominant white political society and cultural society would be a significant injury, and I think still is a black eye on the history and long tail of white supremacy, which is that white supremacy might posit that black people are in fact incapable of doing the very thing that they ended up doing. And so to do that then at scale, in the case of McCabe, right, to convince the US government to have an entire state for black people, built by black people and run by black people, would be a significant one. So the very idea, regardless of its feasibility, was an injury to white supremacy. Then the execution of it, marred in controversy though it was, problematic in many cases though it was, yet and still injured white supremacy. And even today, right, in the lingering remnants of that black town movement and that black state movement in places like Oklahoma, where yes, we once had over 50 black towns, but now we still have 13 remaining, it still is a counter narrative to the notions of what black people are and have been capable of and will ever be ever capable of. And so I think in that way it is a significant injury to white supremacy.
So Oklahoma enters the United States in 1907 as a state. Before that, what is now Oklahoma largely was so-called Indian territory, which was supposed to be the land of the Indians. Recall that decades earlier, in the 1820s, 1830s, there had been the so-called Trail of Tears, whereby the indigenous from the southeast quadrant of North America were expelled to Indian territory, which leads to the question, how did black people in Indian territory and in Oklahoma, how did they relate to the indigenous population?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the reality is that there were already black people in Oklahoma long before McCabe got there, right? So you referred earlier to the Indian Removal Act and the really heinous actions of our U.S. government to uproot, in some cases violently, many indigenous nations, right? Autonomous, self-governing institutions and peoples, and migrate them forcibly to what is now considered Oklahoma. A lot of the people who were with them, right, estimates range between 10 to 30%, were in fact black people, some of whom were enslaved by some of these indigenous nations and people, some of whom were already fully integrated, some of whom had been adopted in, some of whom had married in. And so there was a long tradition, oftentimes overlooked by a lot of dominant history, but very much appreciably understood by a lot of other historians, of black people and indigenous peoples, especially these indigenous nations, having much more creative and expansive notions of what it meant to become a citizen of those nations. McCabe, in particular, though, as one can understand, coming in the 1880s and 1890s, after a lot of these indigenous nations already had been promised that the 1830s would be the last of it, were of course then relegated to even fewer land, forced into private property ownership through things like the Dawes Commission and the Dawes Act, which further decreased the land holdings by over 90 million acres, sometimes 100 million acres, depending upon what estimates you're using. And so in walks McCabe, right, to do what is and what he calls a Negro colonization scheme of Oklahoma, right? He is using, as Audre Lorde would say, the master's tools to try and effectuate the sort of change that he wants to create this safe haven for black people. So you can imagine there are many, many instances in which this rubs a lot of people who are citizens of some of these indigenous nations the wrong way. And so in the book, as your listeners who hopefully will become my readers will find out, there is a fascinating scene towards the eastern portion of what we now consider Oklahoma, what is then Indian Territory, in which there is a massive standoff and relative battle, which is in this luscious part of Oklahoma known as Goose Creek, right? So I think the best way to answer your question is there are a multitude of reactions. And in the book, there are several instances in which we see this happening. But what it does, I think what it demonstrates is that Oklahoma and a lot of the American West have historically and even presently today in its current politics are oftentimes used as a laboratory for the US to kind of consider, well, what sort of country ought we be? How should we operate? Who should we dispatch there? So in many cases, what we see in the book is a collision of many dreams. We don't see the dying and death of dreams. We see the collision of different people groups, often who had been mistreated by the US government, mistrusted by dominant society, trying to forge a new life for themselves. So we see poor white immigrants, we see Black people, we see Black indigenous people, we see indigenous peoples all vying for an opportunity to establish or reestablish themselves and participate in their own versions or in their own ways of different multiracial democracies, right? So to some extent, it is the country's ongoing desire to figure out who will we be collectively taking place in microcosm. And I think that's what we see in the case of Black people and their interactions with various Indian nations.
As you likely know, the football team of the University of Oklahoma has had the best record in the nation since 1945. And they're doing quite well so far this season as well.
They are.
So I've had occasion to watch many of their games, and I've noticed that their mascot, they're called the Sooners. Mm-hmm. And you have students in a covered wagon
Yep.
who storm onto the football field.
Yes.
And I've been made to believe that they represent settlers who jumped the gun with regard to seizing what had been indigenous land, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly, right? Even I distinctly remember David L. Payne Hall at the University of Oklahoma where I attended. And, he's kind of considered the father of Oklahoma. Well, he was one of those Sooners, people who just couldn't wait, right? They were worse than the Boomers. They just could not wait to execute their version of colonization on those lands, such that they would use chicanery, trickery, and sometimes violence to force their way in long before. And in many ways, a lot of, we would normally say these sort of references to uglier times in our history are oftentimes hiding in plain sight. I mean, it's not even hiding, right? It's just in plain sight in Oklahoma. So even as a child, when I first moved there, I distinctly remember in fourth grade, to personalize it and make it even more recent for your listeners, I remember it being fourth grade and we were learning about Oklahoma history, and we were all given wagons and stakes to place into the ground, rope, protractors to measure exactly. And then they would dot the outline of the back lot of our school with kids who they thought might be able to play the indigenous people. And then the goal was, again, as a kid from New York, I knew none of this. We were there to then enact the land run, to kick out those indigenous peoples. I mean, it's a practice that was only outlawed in Oklahoma City public schools alone in 2014, right? The practice still happens in different parts of the state forever and always. And the University of Oklahoma is perhaps the most public way, because people watch us on some major broadcast networks and on ESPN, to see it viewed in plain sight. It's not hiding. In fact, it's the calling card of our state's distinguishment, right? It's how we distinguish ourselves is Boomer and Sooner. That is embedded it's hardwired into what the state is.
Now, what about these Black towns that were established, such as Langston and Boley?
Mm-hmm.
They still exist, I presume, and are there others that still exist? And paint a picture of them historically and in the contemporary sense.
Sure, yeah. So McCabe founded several of those, right? Langston, Liberty, Lincoln. was involved a lot with some of the large settlements and townships or unincorporated portions of Kingfisher, Oklahoma. Places like Boley were actually founded in partnership with a lot of these Black citizens of the Muskogee Creek Nation. So these towns were established in part A by necessity, right? Even though it was the American West, even though these were yet territories and not states, Jim Crow had visited itself upon these places such that people had to be separated, Black people had to be separated from their white peers. So a lot of these towns were founded as a result of that. But then also a lot of really important cultural traditions have emerged and been maintained. So as in the case of Boley, the country's very first Black rodeo, the invention of several rodeo competitions were on the grounds of Boley, where I've reported from for the Atlantic. But then also places like Langston, for McCabe, he really founded it as much more of what he kind of envisioned as a bit of a Black metropolis in what would, in his mind, become the capital of his very Black state. And he was named after John Mercer Langston, someone McCabe revered a great deal. And many of the town streets, be they Bruce Street, named after Blanche Bruce, the first United States Senator, Black United States Senator elected to serve a full term, Massachusetts in reverence of the work of the New England Immigrant Aid Society that made the pilgrimages to places like Kansas possible for a lot of Black people known as exodusters. So there is this constant recall to history. Now, the reality is that while they were numerous, right, myriad in nature, right, there were 50 of them at one point, a lot of them, resorted to unincorporated status. A lot of them have faded a bit, right? But in places like Langston and Boley, others like Taft, right, the very first Black female mayor in the United States, Taft, Oklahoma, a lot of these places are still alive. The issue is that many of them, aside from being outright discriminated against, many of them were also heavily reliant on agriculture. At the precise time when, of course, you had things like, yes, the Dust Bowl, but then after that, with the advent of the oil and gas industry, a lot of these towns were not factored into it. A lot of these towns, like other Black towns throughout the country, like Nicodemus, Kansas, were intentionally left out of train depot routes, right? Such that they were kind of left out of the centers of commerce at that time. And so it made it harder for them to weather those darker, harder times. So those towns, to me, are really special places, and in many cases are being held together by people who are octogenarians and older. But those folks are also kind of this broker between the past and the present in ways that are so very powerful towards how we build our futures.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, there was also an exodus from Oklahoma northward to Alberta, Canada. What is the connection between the movement for a Black state in Oklahoma and the subsequent exodus to Canada?
Yeah, so I mean, as your listeners who will become my readers will learn, McCabe really had a rough go of it, especially as Oklahoma became part of the Union. The very first law that it passed was not like other places around the country, setting up institutions and structures and laws and rules that would govern just basic living. No, they decided to make the very first law that they would pass a Jim Crow law, a separate train car law. And in the book, readers will see McCabe kind of realizing that he's come to the end of his rope. And even though he spends what little he has left in his later years fighting that case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, he does join in an effort with an old friend of his from Kansas, someone named Benjamin Pap Singleton, who likewise kind of saw the tides turn against them, right? Post-Reconstruction, entering this new century, where it felt as if whatever sort of modest gains Black people were able to make, they were bent on rolling them back. They were bent on making Oklahoma, like much of the West, really another iteration of the South. And so they began to do what they had done before. And they developed colonization schemes in parts of Victoria, Canada, and otherwise. And of course, that plan was waylaid, and people like Benjamin Pap Singleton, who had escaped earlier in his life to from Tennessee to Canada before he came back to the States, that was a very short-lived effort that McCabe was involved in, very, very short-lived. And so as such, it takes up a very small portion of the book, but it is yet and still a bit of an elegy, right? It's a bit of a sad song and reflection of where Black people's ambitions took them, especially after they found out how capped and limited they would be here.
Finally, Caleb Gayle, author of the book Black Moses, what's next on your research agenda?
Yeah, there are two things that are really on my research agenda right now. I'm very fascinated by people like McCabe engaging in what some scholars would call vernacular statecraft, whereby they are kind of using their own means, even though they might not really be found as much on the archival records, official archival records. They were kind of creating their own stories, and so to some extent, I'm always very interested in when that gets people in trouble. And so while I'm not, for instance, interested in doing another exhaustive biography of someone like Garvey, I'm very interested in the ways in which the United States government positioned itself against Garvey, oftentimes infiltrating his efforts with Black agents and law enforcement officials, oftentimes built our modern America, especially when it comes to the America that J. Edgar Hoover wanted. Likewise, and have been for the past several years, really been heavily investigating the racial wealth gap and how that really isn't necessarily, as we know, it's not, there's been no exhaustive work on it in that there's no end to end from beginning till now. It's usually an assemblage of snapshots, but perhaps there's a way, and I think that there is, to narratively walk a reader through history that they can see as opposed to being told, right? I want to show what and how it happens and how theft and kind of the acceptance of criminality, oftentimes on the part of a lot of white people throughout history, kind of proliferated the impact of the racial wealth gap. So those are the two things that I'm really spending time on right now. And I'm very excited to see what it becomes in the near future.
Well, we're equally excited, Professor Gayle, and thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you, Dr. Horne.
We send many thanks to Professor Gayle for joining us to share his hard-earned knowledge with us this morning. Please allow me to remind you that you are tuned in to KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live online at kpfk.org. Today is a day for you to pay it forward as our latest fund drive is underway. You are at the center of making this vital service possible when you support your local station. Public radio stations like KPFK exist to serve your community with music and news that enrich your life because listeners like you stepped up in the past to make it possible. Keep public radio strong here in our state by donating to KPFK right now, becoming a member today, or renewing your membership now at kpfk.org/donate. You can also call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. We appreciate any and everything you are capable of contributing and hope you enjoy our next interview. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is David Tyroler Romine, lecturer in history at Winston-Salem State University in North Carolina, and author of the book Something to Do with Power, Julian Mayfield's Journey Towards a Black Radical Thought, 1948 to 1984. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, David Tyroler Romine.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Horne. It's always a pleasure. I frequently listen to your show, so it's nice to be invited on.
And it's nice to have you. So who was Julian Mayfield, and why did you decide to write a book about him?
So that story actually starts in the Schomburg Center for Black Art Research and Black Art and Culture in Harlem, Manhattan, New York City. I was there on a summer research trip, and I was actually working on another project that I had begun when I was writing my dissertation prospectus that I was slowly realizing wasn't going to work out for me. So it was originally this project where I was examining African-American, Francophile African-Americans who had been working in West Africa during the 30s and the 1940s. And what I realized as I was working in the Schomburg was that I was coming up empty. But also while I was there, I was trading boxes with another researcher, a guy by the name of Andrew Rosa, who's at Western Kentucky. And at the end of the day, Andrew and I were on our way down the elevator together. We were sort of joking about the fact that we kept trying to get the box that the other one had. And he asked me if I had read Julian Mayfield's autobiography, because it was Julian Mayfield's papers that we were trading boxes for. And I said, I skimmed it a little bit, but I had actually read it. He's like, I think you should read that, because as good as some of the other work that's been done on Mayfield, you might want to give this a look. And so then the very next day, that's exactly what I did. I sat there, I read the autobiographical manuscript from cover to cover, and came away with a sense that this story really needed to be told. And while Julian Mayfield appears in a lot of other work on mid-century U.S. African-American history, he is he's a resource more than a character, right? He's a supporting character. He's not a main character. And I felt that he deserved not only his own narrative, but a close examination of his writings and his contributions to the broader Black radical tradition of the era. And so with that in mind, I came to my dissertation advisor hat in hand, and I said, I want to change my project. And fortunately, she said yes. And that, as we say, is history.
So where was he born? When was he born? When did he expire?
So Julian Mayfield was born in Greer, North Carolina, which is a small town near Clemson University, actually. He was born in Greer in 1928. He is the oldest, the oldest of two children. He had a younger sibling named Dorothy, who was born a few years later. And his family moved around a little bit. They first go to Asheville, North Carolina, before ending up in Washington, D.C. in the mid-1930s. And from there, he spends the rest of his childhood in Washington, D.C., and he doesn't really leave until he joins the Peacetime Army in 1945, goes to Hawaii, goes to California. And upon returning, he decides that he wants to take advantage of his GI Bill benefits, and heads up to Pennsylvania, where he attends one semester of college at Lincoln University. And college really wasn't for him. So he goes on to New York City, where he tries to become an actor. But as to your earlier question, he lives until 1984, when he expires of complications due to a heart attack.
Now, Mayfield was involved in a film project that did achieve liftoff. I'm speaking of Uptight. Mm-hmm. I understand he was not only an actor, but had a role in the screenplay, the movie starring Ruby Dee and Raymond St. Jacques, and a number of other luminaries from that era. Talk to us about Uptight.
Absolutely. So Uptight is, in fact, Uptight is not Julian Mayfield's first Hollywood film role. He has a very small part in a film with Sidney Poitier called Our Virgin Island, which is a John Cassavetes vehicle from the early 1960s or late 1950s. So he had sort of been bitten by the Hollywood bug then, but it isn't until 1968 that he is approached by Frank Silvera. Silvera is a black actor and had actually been Mayfield's acting teacher when he first came to New York. And Silvera approaches him and said, hey, Jules Decine, right, who's fresh back from Europe from his blacklist exile, is looking to make a movie that's going to feature a lot of black actors. You should go talk to him. So Mayfield shows up, he talks to Decine, and Decine turns around and says, first of all, I'd like to hire you as a writer, but I'd also like for you to do a screen test for the part of Tank, which is the main protagonist. So Mayfield does, he gets the part, and then him and Ruby Dee, who had come on board a few months before, and Decine sit down and begin to work on the script. According to Mayfield, Decine had actually wanted Ossie Davis, Ruby Dee's partner, to work on the script with him, but Davis was already committed to Cotton Comes to Harlem, and so he simply didn't have time. But the three of them, Dee, Mayfield, and Decine, sit down, rewrite the script, which is itself an adaptation of the John Ford film Betrayal, right, which is a story about betrayal in the Irish Revolution, ultimately ending with the death of the protagonist. And what Decine had intended to do with this project when he got the funding was to sort of transpose the situation in Ireland in 1916 to Harlem in the 1960s, right? So the black and tans, your sort of English paramilitaries, are the police officers of the NYPD. The Irish Republicans are your African-American radicals, and really play that same story out. He decides in early 1968 to forego Harlem and actually set the film and shoot the film in Cleveland, Ohio, which proves to be both more challenging and I think more interesting than if it had been done in Harlem. But Mayfield's role in that really not only demonstrated to him that the process was doable, but that there was at least some interest in that moment from Hollywood studios and white producers to create or to produce a film, right, that had a large black cast and one that was really interested in at least black revolutionary activity or rhetoric. And so the film, which gets released in 1969, comes out and is something of a flop. It is fairly well reviewed by many film critics, but the message of the film seems to miss most of its targets, right? The film is a examination, right, of the conditions facing the Black Revolution at the end of the 1960s, in this tension between the Black Power militants, who are represented by the committee, right, that features Raymond St. Jacques, as you mentioned, and the sort of civil rights, the sort of standard civil rights group that is sort of represented by Frank Silvera. And in this climactic argument or debate that happens at a disused bowling alley in the film, they're trying to understand how to move forward, right? Especially after the death of, after the assassination of King. And they ultimately don't come up with a solution, right? And in a lot of ways, I think what Mayfield and Dee were doing there is they're mimicking the conversations that are happening in the movement at that point in the late 1960s. But the film really falls flat. It falls flat with younger people who see Mayfield and Dee as not being sufficiently radical and militant enough. And it falls flat with an older generation who sees the radicalism portrayed by the character of Johnny and his gang as being sort of beyond the pale and not being appropriate. And so with the exception of a good opening weekend, the film kind of quickly disappears from theaters and then ultimately doesn't really show back up until the 2000s. In 2014, a company called Olive Films re-releases the film on DVD, and that is the first time it's been sort of available outside of a theater or a television. And it is now sort of enjoying a very minor revival. And I'm actually really hoping that people who read my book will go find that film too, because I think it's a really good portrayal of the conditions of the movement at that time.
So before this 1969 film, he spent time in Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana. Nkrumah overthrown with the complicity of the U.S. authorities in 1966. Talk to us about his experience in West Africa.
Absolutely. So Mayfield ultimately ends up in West Africa after an encounter with the FBI in Monroe, North Carolina. And for your listeners who are familiar with Monroe, that is the home of Robert Franklin Williams, who was a proponent, a civil rights activist and a proponent of armed self-defense, beginning in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And Mayfield is actually in Monroe in August of 1961 during that fateful encounter with a white couple who had accidentally driven into Robert F. Williams's neighborhood. He rescues them from an angry crowd, puts them up in his house for a little while, and then gets charged with kidnapping them. This prompts the Williams family, so Robert and Mabel and their two boys, along with Julian Mayfield and I'm forgetting her name, May Mallory, to get into Julian Mayfield's Nash Rambler and drive to Canada. Ultimately, it is only Mayfield and the Williamses that end up in Canada. May Mallory goes back to Cleveland, where she gets arrested and put on trial. But as Mayfield is hanging out in Canada, trying to figure out what to do next, his wife, Dr. Ana Olivia Cordero, has been offered a position in Ghana, working for the Department of Health, or the Ministry of Health, excuse me. So she, after discussing things with him, decides to take the position. So she and her oldest son, Raphael, get on a plane to London, where they are met by Mayfield, and then they arrive in Accra, actually right at the same time as Queen Elizabeth's famous 1861 visit. And from there, Mayfield insinuates himself into, or is invited into, the Afro-American community, who are a group of African-American, self-exiles and other interested people who have sort of surrounded Kwame Nkrumah after Nkrumah had invited people from the diaspora to help him build the country of Ghana. Among those that are there already are Maya Angelou, W.E.B. Du Bois, and a number of other important intellectuals who later go on to have careers elsewhere, right? UC Guyana, for example, is there in the 1960s. And Mayfield finds himself really invigorated by this encounter with Africa, and is immediately offered a job in what's called Flagstaff House, which was Nkrumah's sort of PR department, and really throws himself into this project, right, of building this new nation. Along with a growing sort of community of African Americans and West Indians. He's part of this group of young and radical diasporic Africans who are really favored by Nkrumah and really contribute significantly, at least to the discourse and the expression of Ghanaian nation building during this time. He ultimately spends about 5 years in Ghana, and he actually leaves in January of 1966, not because of the coup. He leaves about a month before the coup. Part of that is that his marriage is disintegrating. Part of it is he's overworked and kind of burned out, so he decides to take a break. He turns over the editorial duties of the African Review, which is the magazine he's publishing, to Jan Carew, another Guyanese Black intellectual, and then goes to Carew's villa, which is on the island of Ibiza in the Mediterranean. And he's there working on a couple of different books when he gets news of the coup. And unfortunately, he's unable to return to Ghana at that point, right? His wife, Ana Olivia Cordero, is there. She ends up getting arrested and then deported along with their two children. And he doesn't return to Ghana again until about 1981. But that Ghanaian interlude, right, this 5 years where Mayfield is working for Kwame Nkrumah, was really instructive. And it gave him not only firsthand experience with the difficulties, right, of not only sort of solidarity across the diaspora, but in the difficulties of constructing a new nation. And so what ends up he has a sort of a double intellectual life at this point too, because on the one hand, publicly as an agent of the state and as someone who believes in Nkrumah's sort of United States of Africa project, he is publicly supportive of the Nkrumah government and is a really strong defender. Privately, he's a little worried, especially by 1964, 1965, as Nkrumah's paranoia and frustration with the constant sort of assassination attempts and overthrow attempts and disruptions by the United States and its allies begin to take its toll. And so Mayfield, especially going forward, and you see this, I think, very clearly in the script to Uptight, is attempting to teach his readers where Nkrumah went wrong, the mistakes Nkrumah made, and what Nkrumah had to face as a Black leader in Africa in the 1950s, 1960s, and ultimately someone who was overthrown because his economic and social policies were simply unacceptable to the neo-colonial governments in other African states.
We're going to take a quick pause from the interview to thank you for tuning in to Freedom Now right here on KPFK 90.7 FM. I also want to remind you that we are presently in Fund Drive, and the station needs your help. You rely on public radio for independent music, trustworthy news, and authentic culture. Think about what KPFK means to you and put a value on it today. Now more than ever, we're relying on you to keep KPFK free and thriving in Southern California. To become a member today or to renew your membership now, go to kpfk.org/donate or call 818-985-KPFK. That is 818-985-5735. We thank you as always for your continued support, and even if you aren't able to make a contribution today, we still send you abundant thanks for tuning in. Now let's get back to Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor David Romine.
So Mayfield also had a state-building experience, if you like, in Guyana,
Absolutely.
the predominantly English-speaking country on the northern coast of South America, that among other things features what appears to be deep-seated conflicts between a predominantly African population and a predominantly South Asian population. Talk to us about his experience in Guyana.
Absolutely. So Guyana is really interesting for a variety of reasons. The first one is that Mayfield is very self-conscious going into Guyana in 1971. So he actually ends up there because his friend Tom Feelings, who had been another of these Afros who were in Accra during the 1960s, Tom Feelings has found himself in Georgetown, Guyana by 1971. And after sending a letter sort of encouraging Mayfield to come down, he ends up publishing that letter in the Black Scholar, where he sort of lays out the cause for supporting Forbes Burnham, who is the Prime Minister of Guyana at this point. Guyana, as you said before, not only is there a significant African population, there's a significant South Asian population, primarily of Bengali descent, but beginning in the aftermath of emancipation in the British Caribbean, the British began to import South Indians or South Asians from the Indian subcontinent en masse, such that by the turn of the 20th century, the population is about 40% African, 40% of Indian descent, and about 20% everybody else. So right, that's Amerindians, that's Portuguese, that's English, etc. And that's kind of the demographic breakdown even today. So technically, Guyana is it's a West Indian country that has an African minority. It also has a South Indian minority, has a white minority. It has no majority population. It's all pluralities. And that presented unique challenges, but it also presented Mayfield with what he thought was a golden opportunity. In some ways, he wanted to try again, right? His nation building project in Ghana had gone awry. And what he saw in Guyana was a do-over or an attempt, another chance. And he really threw himself in wholeheartedly. He also was in a very different place in his life, right? When he arrives in Ghana in 1961, he's 33 or 34 years old, and he's about to have his second child. and he's married. But when he arrives in Guyana in 1971, he is divorced, or soon to be divorced. They are estranged at this point. And he has newly fallen in love. He has met a young woman down there named Joan Cambridge, and is very intrigued with her and with her political project, right? She already works for Forbes Burnham. She's part of the Art and Culture Ministry. And together they envision their role as being very similar to what he was doing in Ghana, right? Which is the sort of the voice of the new regime, right? The voice of a government that would not only seek to benefit Guyanese, right, at the expense of European companies and corporations, but to decolonize the minds of the Guyanese, right? So, for example, right, when there's talk about introducing television to Guyana, Mayfield strongly against it, right? He says, look, there's a lot of television that is going to discourage the people of Guyana from working hard and from decolonizing their minds. We can't let this happen, right? Instead, he proposes, more radio programs, interviews, and lectures by radical African and West Indian authors. Really, this completely different project. And the Guyanese example is very also different from Ghana in that Mayfield plays a much more significant role in Guyana than he did in Ghana. While Kwame Nkrumah was certainly aware of Mayfield and they exchanged letters and they met, he was not on a first name basis with Nkrumah the way he was with Forbes Burnham. Forbes Burnham also apparently was a much more gregarious man and much more of a glad-handing politician. Mayfield accompanies him on numerous trips around the country in electioneering and in preparation for the national elections, and he gets a real first-hand perspective on Burnham, and he has a lot of respect for him and a lot of interest in what it is that he's going to do. Ultimately, though, the Guyanese situation ends in a somewhat unsatisfactory way. So in 1974, Mayfield begins to work on a biography of Forbes Burnham, where he conducts numerous interviews. He goes to Burnham's hometown. He interviews people that came up with Burnham and the Guyanese political establishment, and he writes a manuscript, Burnham of Guyana. And in 1975, he submits that manuscript to Burnham and goes back to work. And he doesn't hear back from Burnham for about 2 weeks. And this is alarming because usually he gets phone calls every single day from the Prime Minister. In fact, the Prime Minister has had a special direct line installed to his house from the Prime Minister's desk so that he can call Mayfield whenever he wants and be assured of getting a response. When that phone doesn't ring for 2 weeks, Mayfield becomes concerned. And while Mayfield is concerned, Joan Cambridge is even more concerned. So she immediately books a trip back to Washington, D.C. And while they're there, they go to the doctor and they get a cardiologist to write a letter explaining that Mayfield's heart is acting up and he needs some time, so they're going to stay in Washington because Cambridge was convinced that Burnham was going to imprison or expel or do something with Mayfield based on his response to this book. And Mayfield never goes back to Guyana at that point. In fact, Joan Cambridge doesn't return to Guyana until 1985 after Burnham himself is dead. And so Guyana, I think the portrayal of Guyana that I tried to capture in the manuscript or in the book is right. It is certainly inspired by his time in Accra, and it is a project that is similar on the outside, but ultimately the timing, right, the ideological questions, the political situation in the mid 1970s is fundamentally different, and it creates a very different experience where Mayfield finds himself arguing against Pan-Africanism and instead for a kind of third world nationalism, and it becomes very sort of ideologically complicated and interesting from a intellectual history perspective. So I think Guyana was less well known, I think, in the literature, and so I've hoped that between my project and I know that Russell Rickford has a book coming out on Guyana, I think this year or maybe next year, that I'm really looking forward to. I think that's going to be a really good explanation of what was happening in Guyana during the 1970s.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. David Tyroler Romine, lecturer in history, Winston-Salem State University, North Carolina, author of the book Something to Do with Power, Julian Mayfield's Journey Toward a Black Radical Thought, 1948 to 1984. And of course, if we had more time, we discuss your intriguing chapter on Mayfield's relationship to the U.S. Communist Party. But I'm afraid we're up against the tyranny of the clock. So thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me.
In the spirit of God, in the spirit of the ancestors, in the spirit of the Black Panthers, in the spirit of Assata Shakur, we make this movement towards freedom for all those who have been oppressed and all those in the struggle. Yeah, check it. There were lights and sirens, gunshots flying. Cover your eyes as I describe a scene so violent, seemed like a bad dream. She laid in the blood puddle, blood bubbled in her chest. Cold air brushed against open flesh, no room to rest. Pain consumed each breath, shot twice with her hands up. Police questioned, but shot before she answered. One Panther lost his life, the other ran for his. Scandalous the police were, as they kicked and beat her. Comprehension, she was beyond, trying to hold on to life. She thought she lived with no arm, that's what it felt like. Got to the hospital, eyes held tight. They moved the room to room, she could tell by the light. Handcuffed tight to the bed, through her skin they bit. With guns to her head, every word she got hit. Who shot the trooper, they asked her. Put mace in her eyes, threatened to blast her. Her mind raced, still things got still. Opened her eyes, realized she's next to her best friend who got killed. She got chills as they told her that's what she would be next. Hurt mixed with anger, survival was a reflex. They lied and denied visits from a lawyer, but she was building as they tried to destroy her.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Caleb Gayle, representing Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, and author of the book Black Moses, a Saga of Ambition and the Fight for a Black State. Next up, we give thanks to Professor David Romine from Winston-Salem State University in North Carolina and author of the book Something to Do with Power, Julian Mayfield's Journey Towards a Black Radical Thought, 1948 to 1984. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder Babadidan Kamathi. Shout out to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. This station is an essential resource in your life. Whether it is reliable information that you can use or joyful music that inspires your community, this station provides you with programming that you rely on. You are an essential part of this station as well. Listeners provide the funding that keeps the news, information, and the arts alive. Listeners' money fuels this station's power to operate, so if you are going to continue to count on this station, please remember its staff and volunteers like us count on you. Your contribution this hour enables this essential resource to provide vibrant radio, and here's how you can help right now. To make a pledge, call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. You can also go online to kpfk.org and make your pledge today. This, of course, has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.